All right, so this morning we're going to be talking about sexual harassment, and I wanted to begin first with some anecdotal stories from my own career of situations that have risen that all of these would be considered some form, or at least would be perceived as some form of harassment. So first, my first incident was actually my second year coaching. And I was in my office over in Ludwig Center, is where my office was at the time, and I had some student athletes, female student athletes, come to my office, and they were concerned. They had some questions, and they said, "So, coach, as a male coach, how often do you rub out your athletes?" And I said, "Never. I don't ever physically manipulate my athletes. I don't think that is my job. That is the job of the trainer." And I'm very cautious about my interaction with female students as a male coach. And then they were asking, well, how often are you alone with your athletes in the training room? And I said, again, never. And then they were like, well, how often do you ever create travel situations where, again, you're alone with your athletes, or even have secured a room with you and an athlete? And I said, never. And then they began to proceed to tell me that those were some of the practices that were happening with their team. And so immediately I said, okay, this is what needs to happen. You need to talk to your athletic director. You need to let them know specifically instances, dates, times, locations about all of these things that have happened. And sure enough, that particular coach was fired. A little more recently, probably within the last 10 years, another situation where I had student athletes come to me and say, again, female student athletes come to me and say, hey, coach, we feel uncomfortable around a particular coach. And I said, well, tell me what you mean. Well, for example, I've had a coach come up and sniff me. And I said, what do you mean, sniff you? Come up and then make a comment about how good I smell. I was like, well, that's a little different. That's a little out of the ordinary. And then they would say, I feel like this coach, same person, watches me as I walk by and oogles at me. Okay, that's a little uncomfortable. And this coach has sent me notes. All, again, would be not appropriate behavior or actions. So then another situation came around. A particular athlete, this is an athlete of mine, who had been bullying players. And so I had a conversation with them in their freshman year and said, hey, you just can't do this. Then their sophomore year, another incident, again with their roommate this time, that they were bullying, and again, warned them again. Then their junior year came along, and she had gotten much better at her practices, and she like she wouldn't bully. But at a practice her junior year, early on, I had an engagement with her and just said, hey, in front of everybody, hey, you can't talk to people like this. And the whole team watched, and they were of concern. And so then the athlete started trying to turn it around that I was bullying her, but I was really just protecting other athletes that had come to me privately and said, hey, coach, so-and-so is doing this. So, well, anyway, long story short, near the end of the season, she was at it again. And so I had a meeting with her one-on-one, and my assistant coaches were with me in that one-on-one. I will rarely speak with a student athlete. If I know it's going to be a difficult conversation, I usually always have an assistant coach with me, and that's good practice, by the way. And then I also document those conversations. Well, anyway, so we're sitting in the locker room, and I'm talking with her, and I again lay out the conditions, lay out what was going on, lay out the poor behavior, the observable. I always talk about observable behavior. What is the athlete doing that is not correct? Lay it out in front of them, and then try to model appropriate behavior. Anyway, it was right after practice. I had a ball bag on my back, and so we have this conversation. The exchange between me and the athlete is not great. It's pretty heated. I leave the room and by saying, this has got to stop, this is your last warning. I walk out. I'm fairly frustrated with this particular student. I'm talking to my assistant coaches. We walk about 20 meters, and I still have this ball bag on my back, and I'm like, ugh. So I turn around, I was like, I got to go put the ball back. I go in, open the door to the locker room, and throw the ball bag inside. As I throw the ball bag inside, out of my left corner of my eye, I realize that the student athlete is still in the room. And all she sees me is open the door and throw the ball bag inside. So I immediately realized, she's going to get the wrong impression. She's going to think that I'm throwing this ball bag at her. But I'm not. I'm throwing the ball bag back into the locker room, thinking she's already gone into the internal locker room where her locker was. But she was still in the main reading room. So I turned around and I looked at her and said, so-and-so, I was not throwing these balls at you. I was throwing them over here. Just wanted to... And then I left. And I knew instinctively at that moment that she was going to make an accusation. So I immediately told my assistant coaches, who were watching from the whole outside of the room, everything happened. I said, guys, you just saw what happened? Yes, they said, we saw what happened. It's like, I threw that ball bag in there, and so-and-so was still in there. They're like, ugh. So I go on. I had another meeting later on that night, a club practice. While I'm at the club practice, I get a call from the young lady's RA saying that she's in tears and that she's very emotional and that she is thinking of suicidal thoughts. So I immediately call my athlete and say, hey, so-and-so, let her know that I cared. Let her know that we're praying for her, that we're watching out for her, that we don't want her, that the conversation that we had was not indicative about, it's not that important as her life. And anyway, long story short, my AD did get a phone call, and I did have to sit down with her and her dad, and we talked it all out. Thankfully, I had documented, I went back to my office the very next day, and I documented the entire scenario, and my assistant coaches were with me. So the moral of the story, the thing that you all need to know and remember, is that as a part of protecting yourself, documenting difficult conversations is extremely important. If you're a male coach, or really these days, it doesn't matter what type of athlete you're talking to, if you're having a difficult conversation, you should always have your assistant coach present if you can. And you should allow your detailed notes about that. Secondly, never have a meeting one-on-one with a player of the opposite sex or a staff member of the opposite sex in a private setting. Always. So for example, ever since I've been a coach for female athletes, I've always had a window to my office, whether a window in my door or an external window in which people could see in. I've always had, whenever I have meetings, one-on-one meetings with people, I have always had someone know, either a note outside my door saying in a meeting, or I notify one of my assistant coaches about our meeting. So these are things that are very, very important to consider and noteworthy, all right?